Aloha champions, and welcome back. Mr. Chambers here, reading another couple chapters from Powerless by Mathew Cody. Today we are on chapters 12 and 13. For your exercise and for all future exercises with Powerless, all I'm asking for you to do is listen to me read, and as I'm reading, draw a picture of one thing that happens in the story and write a short one-paragraph summary of what you heard happen in the story. So draw a picture and write a short summary of what happened in the story. With that being said, let's get into chapter 12, Mollie's New Plan. That night, Daniel could barely sleep. He kept replaying the day over and over in his head, the meeting with Herman Plunkett, the drawings of the shroud. It was the same shadow that had taken Simon's powers away, the same shadow that had looked Daniel in the face. He was sure of it. Daniel suspected that he was not the only boy in the history of Noble's Green who could remember seeing that shadow. But what did it mean? Somehow Herman Plunkett had drawn the face of their enemy over half a century ago, and today the only surviving pictures of the shroud were Herman's own sketches. He said himself that they were one of a kind. A crazy thought took root in Daniel's head. Could Herman Plunkett, that shriveled old man, in fact, be the shroud? Looking back on it now, he found that things that once had seemed mundane took on sinister meanings. What had Plunkett really meant with all that stuff about the death of Sherlock Holmes? Was he trying to warn Daniel? To threaten him? In stories, the villain often liked to toy with the hero, to play a game of cat and mouse before the final pounce. But that was in stories, and stories could not be trusted. In stories, good always triumphed over evil. And like so many other children, Daniel had seen enough of the real world to know that wasn't always true. The next morning, he awoke groggy, and his bad arms stayed asleep. Once he started to move around, the blood came back to his arm, and he winced as 1,000 little needle pricks in his skin. Because of the cast, he couldn't even massage the life back into it. All he could do was pound his fist on his pillow and say a bad word or two, which he did very, very quietly. He finished his breakfast quickly and was ready to leave earlier than usual. His mother was already at the hospital visiting Graham, and his father was running late for work while trying to get Georgie ready for daycare, so Daniel didn't linger. Consequently, he was early to the bus stop, a first. While he waited for the others to show up, he rehearsed what he might say to Mollie. If the shoe were on the other foot, she would probably start off with the silent treatment. But Daniel didn't have the patience for that. For once, he would do the talking and she would listen. He had risked his own life for her plan, and she hadn't even had the decency to come by and say thank you. He would need to cut to the chase before she could accuse him of whatever crazy thing that in her mind he had done wrong. He would need to talk fast and loud, and he planned on gesturing to his broken arm a lot for effect. After he had put Mollie in her place, then he would tell Rohan about Herman Plunkett and the shroud. He might let Mollie listen in. As it happened, Mollie and Rohan arrived at the stop together. As soon as he saw them approaching, he made a big show of looking the other way. After all, he didn't want Mollie to think he had been waiting for her. He made sure that his broken arm was facing her as well, just for good measure. "Hey, Daniel." It was Mollie's voice, which surprised him. He expected her to let Rohan do the talking at first anyway. Daniel tried to look surprised. "Oh, I didn't see you guys coming." And that was as far as Daniel got, because when he turned around, he saw the one thing he never expected. Mollie was shamefaced. She wasn't bawling. There were no heaving sobs or anything, but and her face was red, and there was definitely the early signs of tears in her eyes, and a slight quiver in her lip. Daniel stole a glance at Rohan, who just gave one of his "what do I know" shrugs. Said Daniel. That wasn't part of his planned speech. "I'm sorry," whimpered Mollie. "Your arm and Simon, it's all my fault. And I'm so sorry. I wasn't even brave enough to come and visit you." "No, hey, it's okay. It's not your fault. Really, not at all," said Daniel. "Man, I'm a pushover," he thought. "All it takes is just a couple of tears." Crud, he thought. But he knew what he had to do next. Awkwardly, he put his one good arm around her. "It's not your fault, Mollie. Really, it's not. And I think I know whose fault it is. Because I've met him. Twice now." Mollie wiped at her nose with the back of her hand. Daniel watched as she pulled herself together, and the old Mollie came back to life. The Mollie that was itching for a fight with someone. As for Rohan, he just smiled with pride. "Oh, what do you know? That's our detective for you." On the bus ride to school, Daniel filled them in on his meeting with Herman Plunkett and his discovery of the shroud. He had Plunkett's portfolio in his backpack, and both Mollie and Rohan practically shuddered when they saw the cover of issue 77. Daniel described again the shadow he had seen in Simon's bedroom, and no one could deny the eerily similarity to the image depicted in Plunkett's drawing. Selling them on the idea that this little old man might in fact be the shroud, that was another matter, and Daniel accepted that they had a right to be skeptical. After all, he wasn't sure what he believed himself, but Plunkett was the only lead that they had, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the old artist than he let on. As usual, Mollie pointed out the obvious. If Plunkett was somehow in league with the shroud, then it didn't make much sense to just hand his portfolio, the only real piece of evidence that they had, over to Daniel. Rohan agreed that it was an odd move, but he was more concerned with why Plunkett will be terrorizing the children of Noble's Green. What could an old comic book illustrator gain from it? To put it in detective terms, they had a suspect, but no motive. Whoever the shroud was, whatever it had stolen the powers of hundreds of children over the years, and it had taken their memories. Memories of time spent with their friends. Memories of doing remarkable things or helping people. It was the kind of violence what it did. Of that Daniel was certain. As they arrived at school, they were confronted with another problem. What to do about Eric? His birthday was just a few weeks away, and the plan had been to keep him in the dark until they had enough proof to convince him. But now, even with Plunkett's drawings in hand, they couldn't be sure how Eric would react. He believed in the legend of Johnny so strongly, with such conviction. To him, the old stories in the comic books revealed a greater purpose to the powers. To their lives, the story of Johnny Noble promised a future, that they could all grow up to be heroes if they had just tried hard enough. The bright, shining legacy of Johnny Noble was a way of life for Eric. How would he take the news that the truth might be something far darker? A thing shrouded in shadow. As it happened, when they got off the bus, Eric was waiting for them, leaning next to the school doors as groups of bustling students pushed and shoved their way past. Eric folded his arms across his chest and looked Daniel in the eye. "Man, are you in trouble, Corrigan?" Daniel blanched. Even Rohan took a step backward, bumping right into Mollie. "What are you talking about?" asked Daniel, his voice going an octave too high. "Where's the Phillies cap I sent to the hospital? You know how hard it was for me to even touch that thing? Much less buy one for you." Daniel breathed a sigh of relief. Of course, Noble's Green didn't have a Major League Baseball team, so Eric had chosen the nearby Pittsburgh Pirates as his. Their main rivals just happened to be Daniel's team, the Phillies. It's at home. Although I appreciate the gift, I didn't really want to wear it in front of you. Remind you how sucky the Pirates are doing this season and all. Eric smiled. Thoughtful of you. How's that arm feeling? Itches, but otherwise it's okay. Must have been a heck of a tree that you fell out of. What were you doing climbing a tree at night anyway? Well, Daniel stuttered. Mollie stepped in, because I dared him to, she said. So it's really all my fault. Well, I think he's got to share the blame for going along with one of your crazy ideas. I thought you would know better by now, Daniel. Yeah, well, you know me. Always showing off. Eric smiled again, but Daniel thought he caught a flash of something else on his face. He told himself he was just being paranoid, but for a split second he thought he saw Eric give him a look that he hadn't seen before. Whether Rohan saw it too, Daniel didn't know, but it was Rohan who changed the subject. Have you spoken to Simon much? He asked. Now Eric was definitely troubled, and he made no effort to hide it. Not at all. He barely seems to know who I am. He's a lot worse than any of the others. It's like, not only doesn't he remember the powers, he doesn't remember us. He knows who I am, but he doesn't remember that I'm his friend. Michael drifted away, but this is different. More sudden. It's like he never even knew us. No one said anything after that. Eric's birthday was next, but with the exception of Rose, they were all getting close. Losing your powers and the memory of ever having powers was bad enough, but losing the memories of your friends altogether was something else. This is a new kind of terror. The ringing of the first bell kept them from dwelling on these maudlin thoughts as the entirety of grades 4 through 6 scrambled to get to class on time. Daniel had almost reached homeroom when Mollie grabbed him by his good arm, thankfully, and pulled him behind a stairwell. Hey, what are you doing? I'm going to be late. We have to do something, Daniel. Her eyes were wild with anger. Gone was the humbled Mollie of an hour ago. The old Mollie was back now, and there was no one to save Daniel from her this time. Right now? Mollie, the bell just rang. Snyder will kill us. You heard Eric. It's different now. It's worse. Eric is going to forget about us. Eventually, we'll all forget. Daniel tried to take his arm back, but Mollie held on tight. He tried to look as if it wasn't a struggle, but it was. He was caught. We don't know that for sure, Mollie. It might just be Simon. You don't believe that, Daniel. The Shroud saw you. He knows what we know about him, and this is his punishment. It's not fair. The halls were emptying out now, the last few stragglers running for their classrooms, hoping to make it before the second bell. We can talk about this later. No. Mollie's grip loosened and Daniel took his arm back, but he didn't bolt away. There was that something in Mollie's face, a determination in her eyes that kept him there, just as surely as if she had pinned him to the floor. You don't get it, do you? Eventually there won't be any of us left to remember. Only you. You'll have all these memories, all these friendships, and we won't even know who you are. The second bell rang, and then the hallway was quiet, except for the sound of shutting doors. Mollie was quiet too. All right, Daniel said. What do you want me to do? Tell your parents that we're doing homework together at my house after school. That shouldn't be a problem. Why? We're going to the other side of Mount Noble. We're going to the old quarry. The old quarry? But the rules! Well, we will just have to break the rules. Again, we need answers, Daniel, and we are running out of time. Please, for Eric. Daniel swallowed hard and nodded. Mollie nodded back, and Daniel watched as she turned and strode down the hallway. Her head held high. Mollie Lee was once again a girl on a mission, and strangely enough, Daniel was glad. It suited her. Daniel followed her, but he didn't rush. He was already late. A few seconds more wouldn't matter. As he walked, he remembered that first day in the treehouse and the reading of the rules. The north face and the old quarry are off limits. Danger waits for us there. Danger waits for us there. Today, Daniel was very homesick for Philadelphia. Chapter 13, The Old Quarry. The trip to the old quarry took longer than either of them wanted. Daniel had expected them to fly there, but it turned out he was a lot heavier than Louisa, and since Mollie wasn't super strong like Eric, she didn't want to risk dropping him along the way. And since Daniel had no wish to be dropped, they decided to bike there instead. By the time they arrived, the sun had already started to set. Daniel had only ever seen the south face of Mount Noble. The difference was startling. On the south face, even at night, you could still see the signs of civilization. Hiking trails, the lights of far-off homes twinkling in the distance. But here, the wilds of nature dominated everything. Tangled trees reached high into the sky, and the underbrush was thick and nearly impassable. Except for the quarry, there were no signs of humanity's touch at all. It was obvious to Daniel that for many, many years, the North Face had been off limits to not just the supers, but everyone. It doesn't look like anyone's been here since the quarry closed, he said. No, I doubt that anyone has. North Face has always been an unlucky place. The quarry closed back in the 50s after a bunch of bad stuff happened there. Some kind of accident or something. The Shawnee tribe had a strange name for this place. They called it Witch Fire Mountain. Daniel stared at Mollie. Who are you? And what have you done with the real Mollie Lee? She gave him an indignant look. What, just because you're the detective doesn't mean that I don't know how to use the internet too? I did some research. That's all. Daniel thought back for the first and only time that he had seen a picture of Jonathan Noble. Not the comic book character that he had inspired, but the real man. Mollie, I saw an old photograph of Jonathan Noble standing with a bunch of children, and there was something about a fire. The St. Albans fire, she said. Sure, it's in all the local history books. It's what made Jonathan Noble so famous. Before that, he was just an ordinary fur trader. Daniel remembered the looks of the kids' faces. They were scared and tired. Even Noble himself was a mess, covered in dirt and soot. He hadn't looked much like a hero then. He looked like a man who had just been through something terrible. What happened? St. Albans was some kind of orphanage, connected to the monastery up here. In the 1930s, the monastery burned down. Everyone was killed, except for the orphans themselves. Jonathan Noble was passing by when he saw the fire, and he risked his own life to save them. He rescued every single child. Daniel looked around at the menacing trees and the deep black gorge of the quarry just a few feet away. Let me guess, he said. St. Albans was never rebuilt, and years later, yep, a mining company came in and dug a limestone quarry in the very same spot. The quarry suffered accident after accident, and eventually it was all abandoned. Daniel felt a small chill go up his spine at the thought of all the misery occurring in a single lonely place on the dark side of this very mountain. And here we are, he said. Mollie tossed him a backpack, then flipped on a flashlight and revealed a trail that wound off into the trees that disappeared into a giant pit, the size of a small valley dug out of the sides of the mountain itself. Here we are, she agreed, and with that she started down. The path was dark and treacherous, carved out of the quarry walls. At one time it had been a winding road, wide enough to allow the workers' trucks and other machinery down to the quarry floor. But time and the elements had eroded much of the gravel and dirt away, and today the road was barely a footpath. At points, it was hardly wide enough for a single person to squeeze by. There were a few stumbles along the way, and at one point Daniel thought he saw something move along the path ahead of them. He and Mollie stayed frozen for about 5 minutes, shining their lights up ahead and listening to the sound of their own heartbeats. When nothing else happened, Mollie blamed Daniel's sighting on a coyote or bobcat crossing the path, which didn't make Daniel feel a whole lot better. Cautiously, they resumed their descent. They reached the bottom without further incident, and Daniel was thankful when the sloping path leveled out onto firmer ground. These days, the old quarry was hardly recognizable as a quarry at all. Over 50 years, nature had gone a long way toward reclaiming what humankind had taken away. The deep chasm still remained, but grass, shrubs, and even a few small trees had taken root in the once barren earth. The treasure here had been limestone, and exposed veins of the solid rock were still visible in the walls of the place, though they were hard to see in the fading daylight. There were plenty of corners and crannies down here that were hidden in blackness. Finding clues would be a task indeed. The two intrepid explorers surveyed the area. "This place looks creepy enough," said Mollie as she shone her flashlight in a broad circle around them. "Well, there has to be a reason why it's forbidden. But more importantly," added Daniel as he eyed the desolate landscape, "forbidden by who?" Mollie didn't answer, but the look on her face told Daniel that she was wondering the same thing. "Come on," she said after a moment. "We didn't come here to just stand around worrying." "Careful of sinkholes," she warned. "There are bound to be some deep ones around here that might have filled with water over the years. I'm a great flyer, but I'm kind of lousy swimmer. I wouldn't be much help if you fell in." Daniel followed Mollie deeper into the quarry, careful to shine his light on the ground in front of him. "So what do you suppose we're looking for?" he asked. "I don't know, Daniel. Clues, I guess? You're the detective." Clues, Daniel thought. Right. In an overground quarry 50 years old. Not a problem. They had been at it for about 10 minutes when something began to bother Daniel. The south end of the quarry where they had come in was wild and overgrown. Daniel was covered in scratches and cuts from all the thorn bushes that they had to push through. But as they neared the north end, the underbrush cleared significantly. He found that he could walk without fear of stinging branches whipping him in the face. There wasn't even any spiderwebs spanning the path ahead of them. The path ahead of them. "Mollie, stop," Daniel whispered. "Something's wrong here. There aren't any thorn bushes or hanging vines or anything else. It's a clear trail." So who made this trail?" Mollie's eyes grew wide as she understood Daniel's meaning. And for the first time since embarking on the fool's errand, Daniel allowed himself a little smile. Despite the danger, he couldn't deny that detective work was exciting stuff. He got down on his hands and knees and started searching the ground, examining the weeds and bushes on either side of the trail. "What are you doing?" Mollie asked. "Shine your flashlight down here. I need more light." It didn't take Daniel very long to find what he was looking for. A broken sticker bush twig. He took the twig gently between his fingers and held it up to the light, pointing to the break. "See? The wood's still green. That means the break is fresh. Someone's been through here recently." Mollie looked at Daniel, impressed. Daniel shrugged. "I read a lot." Mollie smiled at this. Then she shone her light along the path, first in the direction of where they had come from, and then where they were headed. "Then how come there aren't any footprints?" she asked. "You can see ours clearly enough. You'd think that whoever broke that twig would have left some too." She was right. Whoever had been using this path was careless enough to clear the vegetation out of his way, but not enough to leave prints. "I don't know," said Daniel, feeling uneasy. "Maybe we'll find the answer at the end of the trail." They started again down the path, more cautiously this time, and walked for another few minutes, before the path ended abruptly at a sinkhole. Half filled with putrid water, the hole was about 5 feet across, too wide to step over and even too wide to jump. Shining their lights, they could see the trail continues to the other side and wind its way off into the blackness. Mollie pointed her flashlight at the foul-smelling water and made a face. Who builds a trail that leads straight into a scum-filled hole? It doesn't make any sense. You've got me. But we'll have to find a way around if we want to see where the rest of the path leads. Daniel started testing at the ground on either side of the sinkhole, looking for safe passage. He could hear Mollie tapping her foot in frustration and impatience. Oh, for Pete's sake, she said. Daniel almost let out a cry as she grabbed him around the waist. Mollie, what? Just hold on. She lifted the two of them off the ground and they flew up in an arc over the watery hole. As they landed on the other side with a thump, a thought occurred to Daniel. Of course. What? Asked Mollie. You just showed me the one way someone could travel up and down this path and not leave any footprints. I was stupid not to think of it earlier. They can fly. Mollie thought on this for a moment, but she didn't look convinced. Well, we know it's not Eric, and we know it can't be Michael. So if there's another flyer in Noble's Green, I guess it's about time I met them. They walked the rest of the way down the path until they reached the far northern wall of the quarry. There, atop a small hill and under a short rock overhang, was the opening to a cave. A quick examination showed that the entrance was sturdy and wide enough for a full-grown person to walk through without having to duck. It looked as though the tunnel went back about 30 or so feet before stopping at a dead end. This time Daniel went first. Mollie, being a flyer, hated small spaces, so Daniel suggested she remain near the entrance. Daniel crept along the dark passageway as silently as he could. Unfortunately, the tunnel echoed with every disturbed pebble. Gritting his teeth against the sound of his own steps, Daniel reached the end. So far the cave had been unremarkable, a natural leftover from the days when men bored into this earth for stone. But here at the end was something else. The tunnel didn't stop on its own. Rather, someone had stopped it. A large disk of solid rock blocked the pathway, like a manhole cover lifted on its side. Two great iron handles were bolted into its face, and the walls around it were scuffed and chipped, a clear indication that this thing had been removed repeatedly. But it would take someone with strength far beyond that of the strongest man to move it. Daniel had just begun to search the cave wall for some kind of hidden lever when he caught sight of his own breath in the glow of his flashlight. He realized that he had instinctively pulled his jacket closer. There was a new chill in the air. Daniel turned his head and saw Mollie standing in the cave entrance, hugging her arms to her sides to keep warm. Just over her shoulders, silhouetted in the twilight, a black shape floated, a shape darker than the surrounding shadow, a shape that Daniel had a name for, the Shroud. His mind screamed the name, but his voice was caught in his throat. Choked off by his fear, for an instant he couldn't move. He was trapped in the memory of that night at Simon's window, the terror of falling. Mollie called to him, "Hey, did you find anything? Hurry up, it's getting freezing out there." Daniel swallowed his fear and found his voice as the Shroud reached for Mollie. "Behind you!" Until that moment, Daniel hadn't known just how fast Mollie was. Not really. He had witnessed her speed in races with Eric, but what he saw before was nothing compared to what he saw now. Or more accurately, what he didn't see. It all happened too fast. The Shroud reached out her ragged hand of the shadow that barely brushed Mollie's shoulder, and instantly she was gone. She must have felt the cold of that touch because Mollie turned into a flash. A girl-shaped blur that was at the cave entrance 1 second and standing next to Daniel, grabbing at his sleeve the next. "Oh my gosh, Daniel, is that him?" Mollie's powers were so revved up that she was even speaking at super speed. Daniel could barely make out her words. "The North Face is forbidden. Danger waits there." The Shroud's voice echoed through the cave like the rustle of dead leaves and the snapping of dry twigs or bones. The shape that rose up to prevent their escape was larger than Daniel remembered. Its billowing black cloak snuffing out the light of their flashlights, its bulk blocking their path. Wisps of darkness seemed to undulate around its body, and its green heart of fire pulsed in slow rhythm. Daniel had the dread suspicion that he and Mollie had just discovered the author of the rules. The rules weren't meant to protect the children. They were meant to protect this thing, to keep its home safe. And the two of them had just been caught trespassing. Mollie grabbed hold of Daniel's cast. He put his good hand on hers to calm her, but he realized she wasn't looking for reassurance. She was gently pulling him away. She was leading him slowly toward the entrance of the cave, toward the shroud. "What are you doing?" he whispered. "We're cornered. We're trapped. We need to get outside. Whatever you do, don't hesitate. Follow me as fast as you can. Then just keep running." Daniel stared at the shadow blocking their escape and wondered how they could possibly make it past. It nearly filled the cave, and it was getting closer. "I just hope it's solid," she said. "What? Why?" "So that I can do this." Mollie let go of Daniel's arm and flew straight as an arrow toward the shroud. She slammed like a bullet into the chest of the thing. As it turned out, the shroud was quite solid, because Daniel heard it gasp as the wind was knocked out of it. Its great swelling blackness crumpled around little Mollie Lee as the two of them tumbled out of the cave's mouth and out of view. Despite Mollie's instructions, Daniel didn't move right away. He was in shock. One minute the shroud was blocking their path, and the next Mollie was flying into the creature and disappearing down the hill. "Mollie!" Daniel snapped to his senses and ran for the mouth of the cave. When he reached the outside, he saw Mollie lying some 20 feet down the hill. She had landed in a bunch of tall grass, and though she was moving, she looked pretty dazed. Unfortunately, the shroud was still conscious as well. It had landed only a few feet from Mollie and was standing, or more accurately, floating upright. Daniel glanced to his left and saw the path clear ahead of him. The way out of the quarry was unguarded, and Daniel had plenty of time now to make his escape, just as Mollie had wanted. But that wasn't what Daniel wanted. There was no way that he was going to leave her here with that thing. It had stolen the powers and memories of countless children, just for the crime of turning 13. Who knew what it might do to Mollie, now that she had invaded its lair? But what could an ordinary boy with a broken arm do against such a monster? Hey, ugly, up here! Was not one of Daniel's best plans, but in the heat of the moment, sometimes there isn't time for thinking. Sometimes you just have to act. The shroud turned its head toward Daniel and seemed to be studying him, judging whether he was enough of a threat to warrant immediate attention. Daniel needed to get it away from Mollie, so he decided to stack the odds in his favor with some good old-fashioned trash talk. "You know, I'm not one of your supers, so your stupid little rules don't apply to me. I think I'll come around here all I want. Matter of fact, I might bring some other people too, like the local sheriff, maybe even the Department of Homeland Security." It was enough. The shroud hissed and reared back its faceless head before slinking across the ground and up the hill toward Daniel. Unfortunately, this was as far as Daniel's plan went. In just a moment, the shroud would have him, and Daniel had no weapons other than his flashlight. Remembering the encounter at Simon's window, Daniel decided to try a desperate trick. He waited until the shroud was just feet from him. Then he flicked on his flashlight, full in its eyes, or at least where its eyes would be if he had them. Even this close-up, Daniel could make out no more detail than before. It was as if someone had cut away a shroud of shadow and given it form, with only that sickly green heart to disturb the blackness. As before, the flash of light seemed to make it hesitate. It slowed its attack and even pulled back slightly. But Daniel's flashlight was only still a flashlight. On its second advance, it dove to the right, quickly avoiding the direct glare of the beam. In one fluid move, the shroud batted the light from Daniel's hands, and all he could do as he watched it clattered down the rocky slope. Daniel felt his breath catch in his chest as he watched long fingers of shadow creep out from the thing's hands. which were flexing and clawing eagerly at its side. But to Daniel's surprise, it didn't turn those hands on him. Instead, it stayed still, and Daniel could feel the monster stare, even if he couldn't see its eyes. Such a smart boy. So smart and so brave for one so weak, so soft, and so breakable. The shroud gestured to Daniel's broken arm. Again, its raspy voice grated along his nerves, making the hair stand up on the back of his neck. Something in its pitch, its timbre, made every impulse in him scream, "Run!" But he held his ground. If he tried to flee, he had no doubt that it would overtake him anyway. You're right. I'm not one of them." Daniel's own voice had lost its earlier bluster. Now he couldn't disguise the terror that he was feeling. "What are you then?" I'm just a boy." "Ah, now there you are wrong." Daniel felt in a gust of wind, and the next thing he knew, he'd been knocked off his feet and yanked up into the air. Something had a hold of him, and that something was Mollie. "We're leaving," she yelled. "Hold on tight." He wrapped his good arm around her waist and watched as the ground disappeared below them. Mollie's face was red and the veins in her temple bulged with the effort, but pure adrenaline was giving her the strength that she needed now. For Daniel's part, he looked down at the disappearing ground and willed himself to think light thoughts. They had broken above the tree line, and Mollie was just making the turn around Noble's Green when Daniel saw the creature rising up through the trees. The shroud was giving chase, and it was gaining. Ordinarily, Daniel wouldn't have doubted that Mollie could help fly it, but with his extra weight, they were losing ground. Mollie felt it too. Without warning, she changed direction and flew up, straight up. "What are you doing?" Daniel shouted, his voice barely carrying over the wind. An old trick of Michael's. "Hang on." And with that, she flew faster, aiming for a bank of low clouds that she had settled around the peak of Mount Noble. The shroud was only a few feet behind them when they entered the clouds. The night sky disappeared in the black mist, and Daniel felt the little pellets of rain sting his face as it turned cold. They were twisting, turning, changing direction, but by now Daniel was too disoriented to know if it was on purpose or if Mollie was simply lost as well. They were flying blind, and Daniel even wondered if she knew which way was up. The shroud appeared out of nowhere. One second they were alone in the dense mist. The next, the creature was blocking their path. Luckily, it seemed as startled as they were, and it hesitated for half a second. Half a second was all Mollie needed to drop below its reach and disappear once more into the murky vapor. Daniel felt another lurching change of direction, and when they broke the cloud cover, they found themselves high in the sky, looking down at the storm bank. The cold wind up here was bitter and thin, and Daniel's ears and fingers began to sting with frost. "There!" Mollie shouted. "Found one!" "Huh?" Daniel managed between chattering teeth. "A current," Mollie said with a smile. "Now we let the wind fly for us." Then they were diving, barreling through the sky and clouds, past trees and mountains. Daniel managed to squint behind them and see that they had escaped the shroud with Mollie's desperate dive. Once more they flew alone while hurtling at a fantastic speed towards the lights and hard ground of Noble's Green. As they flew faster still toward the ground, Daniel noticed that Mollie was no longer smiling. "Uh-oh, too fast," she muttered. He couldn't really hear her in the roar of the wind, but he could read her lips well enough, because it was what he was also thinking as the ground rushed up to meet them. Uh-oh. That will conclude today's reading of chapter 12 and 13 of Powerless by Mathew Cody. As a quick reminder, your task today is to draw a picture of something that happened in these chapters and write a short 3 to 5 sentence paragraph about what you heard in the story. Thank you again for tuning in to listen to me read. I should have the rest of this book up by the end of the weekend. Thank you. Stay awesome. I'll talk to you later.